At dawn, a city pump stands in a street, still wet from night rain. A bucket waits beside it. Windows are closed, and water is carried upstairs, poured into basins, kettles, and household vessels. They did not agree on one explanation for illness. Some turned to bad air and foul smells. Others watched wells, drains, rivers, and the movement of cases through a neighborhood. Public health grew slowly from fear, argument, record-keeping, and repair. The pump was a small machine, but it held a city together. A handle, a spout, a damp stone apron, a bucket rim worn smooth by use. Pull once, and water came up from below. Carry it away, and the street returned to its ordinary look. Yet nothing about it was simple. Every household using a shared source had to think about distance, labor, and the time needed to fill a vessel. Water did not arrive by magic. It arrived by duty, repeated every day. Long before Victorian London, people had controlled water with channels, aqueducts, wells, boiling, filtration, and other practical methods. Shaping water into a civic service was old. By the late 16th century, London already had a pumped supply drawing from the Thames, a reminder that the city had been reshaping its water for generations. That machinery made the work familiar. Water had become shared, managed, and bound to both house and city. Inside the house, that shared water became routine. It entered a kettle, then a basin, then a cloth, then a pot on a hearth. It washed faces, rinsed linen, cleaned floors, and filled a vessel left by a bed. Someone lifted it, set it down, and carried it again. Someone watched the spill on the stair and the wet trail on the boards. A bucket in the street became a weight in the kitchen, then a task at the drain or yard, where the water joined the city again. Illness was often imagined as moving through place as much as through flesh. Many 19th century observers trusted smell. The word miasma named the belief that foul air, corrupted by drains and refuse, could spread disease. A stinking lane, a damp cellar, a gutter breathing back toward the street could seem like enough explanation. The city's odors came from real waste, decay, and crowding, but smell also had a way of closing a question too early. Wastewater management often followed the same logic. Effort went into removing what smelled offensive and separating it from the places where people slept, cooked, and worked. If a drain could be cleared, if a heap could be carried off, if a ditch could be opened and the air made less heavy, a district might seem healthier before anyone knew why. That was practical work. But odor was only one witness. Another set of observers kept returning to water itself. They watched wells, pumps, drains, and river edges. They noticed illness near a source, or clusters of cases following a street, a courtyard, or a shared supply. A single bad room could not explain every pattern. The city offered fragments instead. One household sick, another spared, one lane burdened, another quiet, one source suspected, another left alone. Comparison became a habit, and out of it came a more patient way of reading disease. In 1831, cholera reached London, and sanitation could no longer be ignored. Drainage, water supply, waste disposal, and street cleaning belonged to the same civic problem. A dirty lane was not merely local if it fed a well, a pump, or a river. A household bucket was not merely private if the water inside had traveled through a shared source. Cholera made those connections urgent. Public health was never only a matter of medical theory. It was also a matter of cost, labor, and power. Some streets received attention sooner than others. Some districts had more standing when they complained. Clean water, clean drains, and cleaner streets did not appear simply because the problem was obvious. They appeared where people had the means to press for change, where officials were moved to act, and where a city decided conditions could no longer be left to chance. On paper, the city became easier to compare. A clerk copied names into a ledger. Another hand repeated addresses in a list. Numbers gathered into rows, one line of deaths, one street, 1 week after another. That record-keeping mattered. A page could keep together what rumors scattered, and it could make a pattern visible long enough for someone to ask a better question. The early shape of the method was simple. Write down where illness appears, then look again. The Thames sat at the center of that repeated question. It supplied water to London, and it also received waste from London, and those two roles were never easy to separate. A river that fed a city also carried the city back again. The problem did not disappear because it flowed downstream. As waste moved outward, or as drinking water was drawn from another point, the city was trying to alter the path of contamination rather than erase it. Water remembered direction. Engineers, physicians, and officials approached the same problem. One watched flow and slope, another watched symptoms and proximity, another watched streets and reports. None needed a grand theory to see that repair mattered. A broken drain, a fouled pump, a blocked gutter, a leaking pipe, all of these could shape the life of a block as surely as weather or work. The city changed through repeated small corrections. The office, too, became part of the story. Public health lived in rooms with desks, not only in alleys and basements. There were reports to copy, complaints to sort, and cases to compare. A page of figures might seem cold beside a wet street, but it gave officials something to examine. The quiet achievement was to make a city legible through paperwork, then guide repairs in stone, brick, and iron. The city's water system was therefore never only about supply. It was about waste, notice, and trust. A household trusted the bucket because the bucket had been filled. A street trusted the pump because it had stood there yesterday. A city trusted a source until it had reason not to. When that trust broke, it showed up in sickness and argument. People asked where the water had come from, where the waste had gone, and why one block seemed to suffer more than another. At the edge of the street, the pump waits for a hand. The bucket will be filled, lifted, and carried indoors. The house will use the water without thinking too hard about the route it took to arrive. That silence is part of the story. Public health begins there, in the hope that a city can be made more livable by arranging its ordinary things differently, even when almost no one notices it at all. The bucket has gone inside, but the street is not finished with it. By noon, damp cobbles warm under a thin sun, and the curb grate gathers leftovers: coal smoke, wet ash, horse muck, steam from a laundress's copper, stables, drains, and cellar yards. In a 19th century city, smell was not background. It was one of the first ways people judged whether a place was fit to live in. That smell did not stay outside. It slid under doors, climbed stairwells, and settled into plaster. Narrow houses held kitchen steam, washing suds, damp brick, and stale air. In crowded districts, waste collected in courtyards, seeped from basement cesspits, and ran into gutters. One alley could smell of food, fuel, wet stone, and sewage all at once. These odors made the place feel strained. That atmosphere made a theory like miasma persuasive. It said illness could rise from decay in air, from foul vapors given off by waste, rot, and stagnant filth. It did not describe the real cause of cholera or typhoid, but it matched an experience that was hard to ignore. Streets really were filthy. Rivers really did take on the city's refuse. Rooms really did grow close and sour when windows stayed shut. To many physicians and reformers, bad air seemed like evidence. Not everyone drew the same lesson, and not every street offered the same proof. Some people thought in terms of direct contact, others in terms of waste and ventilation, and many simply held several fears at once. But cleaning became more than housekeeping. It became a public language. Walls were washed, floors scrubbed, gutters cleared, windows opened, and waste hauled away. The house itself became part of the argument. These beliefs found their way into reports and surveys. In 1842, Edwin Chadwick gathered information about living conditions and used figures to show how poor housing, disease, and short lives were connected. The point was to make it visible for officials to act on. Tables, returns, and inspection reports turned the wet corner of a street into an item on paper. What had been a smell in the alley became evidence in an office. Public health was beginning to move from impression toward administration. In those offices, paper had its odor: ink, glue, dust, and damp wool. A clerk could sit over columns of deaths, addresses, and causes, looking for patterns the nose alone could not keep straight. Parish records had long listed burials and mortality, but the 19th century brought a more systematic habit of counting. Deaths could be grouped by place, season, occupation, and neighborhood. That habit mattered because it let reformers compare one district with another. The city became legible piece by piece. The city itself kept making the same point in less orderly ways. A broken drain could sour a whole court. A blocked gutter could leave a lane smelling of last week's rain and yesterday's refuse. A cellar that took in seepage did not need a label to announce its condition. People who lived there knew it by the air in the stairwell. Some neighborhoods were noticed only when they became unbearable to ignore. Then cholera returned again, and the argument over air and water became impossible to keep quiet. In 1831, London saw an epidemic that brought urgency to sanitation. Later outbreaks revived the same questions. If a neighborhood smelled bad, was the smell itself making people ill, or was it only the sign of something else going wrong? Many people did not separate those questions cleanly. The river, the drains, the courts, and the crowded rooms seemed joined together. Along the Thames, that confusion had consequences. The river received waste from houses, workshops, and sewers, and in return it gave back a smell that could roll inland on warm air. London had long depended on the river, but by mid-century it was as much a channel for the city's leftovers as for its commerce. Barges moved along it. So did complaint, and the sense that the city's scale had gone wrong. By the summer of 1858, the problem had become impossible to treat as an abstraction. The smell of raw sewage in the Thames was so strong that Parliament could barely go about its business. The event later came to be known as the Great Stink, and the name captures the force of the moment, an odor so blunt that it pushed decision-makers toward action. The smell reached the place where laws were made. The river had entered politics through the nose. Out of that pressure came a new confidence in engineering. The city treated smell as a problem of routes, gradients, outlets, and distance. Waste had to be carried farther away from the streets and sent downstream. New sewer works would soon change the edges of the river and the hidden shape beneath the pavement. Brick, mortar, slope, and flow became part of public health. The answer to the city's smell was redirection. The change did not arrive all at once. A city did not become clean in a single season, and smell did not disappear just because officials had been embarrassed by it. But the meaning of smell had shifted. It was no longer only a nuisance. It had become a clue, a complaint, a cause for reports, and a reason to dig. Public health was learning to speak in the language of streets, drains, and mortality tables. Even before it had the right explanations for every disease, the old habit of sniffing out danger had been drafted into records. The decisions were never only medical. They were social, political, and financial too, because the people most exposed to bad air were usually the least able to move away from it. In the crowded districts, a clean gutter, a cleared cesspit, or a better drain could change the air in a whole row of rooms. Yet the burden of waiting for those changes fell unevenly. In a house at dusk, the day ended with familiar motions. Water was poured from a basin, a cloth was wrung out, the slop pail was carried out, the window was left open a finger's width. These small acts did not solve the city's problems, but they belonged to the effort of making air less crowded and streets less rank. The household and the city met at the drain, at the curb, and at the stair that led from a kitchen into the street. That meeting point matters because it shows how public health began to take shape, not as a single grand design, but as habits, complaints, tables, and brick channels beneath the road. The street grate remains in place, rain runs through it, wash water follows, so do the leftovers of ordinary life. Above ground, the windows shut again, and the lamps come on. Below ground, the city keeps making a path through the dark. Over time, those smells would be translated into records, and the records into pipes, papers, and habits. In a room where the windows stay high and the ink dries slowly, cholera becomes a line in a book. A clerk opens the weekly return, writes a cause of death beside a name, an age, a street, sometimes an occupation, and the illness leaves the body and enters the archive. Once there, it can be counted and compared. The disease has not become less real, it has become legible. Long before cholera reached 19th-century cities, London had already learned to keep death in paper form. The bills of mortality began as plague records, then became a weekly habit. Parish clerks added baptisms, causes of death, and ages at death. The pages were useful but incomplete, since they reflected the parishes that produced them, not the whole city. Even so, they taught readers and officials that disease could leave a trace before it left a body. In the 17th century, John Graunt looked at those bills and found patterns no family could see from a sick room. Births, deaths, seasons, differences between men and women, the loss of infants, and the contrast between city and countryside all came into view across the page. The work looked ordinary, but it changed how numbers could be used. Death was no longer only a private event or a church matter. It was also a public pattern, and a table could keep a city in miniature. By the early 19th century, parish returns were thinning out, and newer state machinery took their place. The General Register Office, established in 1837, began keeping weekly records of births, deaths, and marriages, and brought the census into the same world. The paper became more regular, standardized, and confident. It was no longer only the language of parish clerks. It was becoming the language of the state, counting a larger city and a wider range of causes. William Farr made that paper work harder. At the General Register Office, he helped turn raw returns into systematic medical statistics. The records mattered not only because they counted the dead, but because they made comparison possible. Mortality among different professions could be compared, neighborhoods measured against one another, and life tables built from sorting and summing. The city became something that could be read as a set of uneven risks. Then cholera arrived in London in 1831, and the numbers filled with urgency. The outbreak landed in a city already strained by industrial growth, crowded housing, and waste with nowhere easy to go. It did not arrive as a neat lesson. It came as a confusing emergency, with symptoms that moved quickly and explanations that moved slowly. Some reached for foul air and decay, others for contagion and contact. The paperwork did not settle the argument, but it kept the outbreak in view. Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report gave that paper a sharper public role. Using surveys and data collection, he showed that poor living conditions, disease, and life expectancy were linked. It pointed toward drains and sewage. It translated unhealthy towns and cities into language that could travel into offices and committees. If housing, crowding, and waste could be measured, they could also be acted upon. Sanitation became more than a local complaint. It became an argument with tables attached. The main theories sat side by side. Miasma theory held that disease rose from foul-smelling air and decaying matter. Contagion theory held that illness could move from person to person. Those ideas led to different measures, yet they often lived together in the same city. If the air was to blame, walls, floors, waste, and drains had to be cleaned. If direct spread was the concern, movement had to be restricted and the sick separated. In practice, both kinds of measures were used. That is why cholera mattered so deeply to records. It forced medicine and administration into the same room. Hospital notes, weekly death returns, parish ledgers, survey reports, and the census came together. A cause of death was no longer only a line for a minister or a family. It became a clue in a larger pattern. Even when people disagreed about the cause, they could agree that the bookkeeping had to improve. John Snow took one of the clearest steps in that direction. In 1849, he argued that cholera spread through water rather than bad air. The idea was not widely accepted, but it mattered because it treated the outbreak as something that could be traced. In 1854, during another London outbreak, Snow gathered hospital and public records, asked households where the disease had occurred, and began to place cases in relation to one another. The arrangement changed the meaning of the city. A cluster of deaths could be seen around one public water source in Soho, and the page could point to a neighborhood in a way that no single witness could. The map did not cure anyone. It made a hidden route visible. Some of it sat in streets, wells, and shared water. William Farr, who had helped build the statistical habit that made such work possible, remained doubtful for a time. The record did not force agreement. Data could be read in more than one way, yet the argument kept returning, and the 1866 London epidemic strengthened the waterborne case further. Farr's figures showed high mortality among people who drew water from the Old Ford Reservoir in East London. Slowly, the numbers moved him. Still, the record was never whole. Parish-based returns missed some lives, and statistical vision depended on who belonged to the system that kept the books. People beyond those bounds could remain less visible than they were in the street. A ledger could count a death and still miss the crowded room where the person had lived, the damp courtyard, the shared water vessel. The archive gave clarity, but not completeness. Even so, the numbers altered the way cities understood themselves. They made it possible to compare districts and years. They supported reports and reforms. They helped turn illness from misery into a public question. That shift did not happen at once, and it did not depend on one man. It came from writing things down, then reading them back against the city. So cholera enters the record not as a single event, but as a repetition. It appears in a weekly return, then in a table, then in a report, then in a map of addresses, then in the dry language of comparison. The disease moves through paper the way water moves through a channel, leaving a trace. When the page is closed, the city remains outside, full of pumps, drains, kitchens, and river water. Yet somewhere in the office, the ledger stays open long enough to suggest that the city can be understood, one careful line at a time, over many years. In the back kitchen, water has furniture. A pail stands under the sink, a basin waits on the table, a cloth hangs over a bowl, and the floor by the door stays dark longer than the rest, because every house that takes in water keeps its own dampness. The room is ordinary. Cities become safer through rooms like this one, where water arrives, is used, and leaves a trace. For many households, the first question is how far the water must be carried. A full bucket has weight. It slows the stair, stains the hem, and leaves the arms remembering the route long after the pail is empty. Some water comes from a shared pump, some from a well, some from a barrel or a cistern fed by the roof. However it arrives, it enters the house as labor. The other half begins at the drain. A sink has only a small opening, but that opening connects to a larger life below the floor. Wash water, cooking scraps, soap, and the remains of cleaning slip away there. In a crowded city, those waters may pass into a cesspit, a gutter, or a pipe. A basement cesspit can overflow into a courtyard, and the boundary between house and street is thin. That thinness gave miasma theory its force. Foul air was not imagined from nothing. Courtyards held refuse, basement cesspits overflowed, streets and gutters carried filth after rain. The smell was immediate and shared. It seemed to rise from the same places where illness seemed to gather. The theory was wrong, but it grew out of a genuinely offensive, cramped, and dangerous environment. Yet smell could not explain everything in those streets. A well might look clean from above and still be troubled by what lay beside it. A drain could leak through the soil. A sewer could run close enough to alter water in a place that seemed untouched. Water did not stop at the edge of a house. It moved through earth, brick, and pipe, carrying what people could not see. A shared well or public pump could sit in the middle of this uncertainty. A rope goes down. A bucket rises. The water looks plain and may seem clear. Nearby, a brewery can have a deep well of its own, and the people inside can draw from that separate source, while the surrounding streets draw from the public pump. One narrow difference in supply can change the pattern of illness across a neighborhood. More people lived closer together. More waste was produced in less space. More houses depended on the same shared routes. London had long been taking water from the Thames and sending it outward to the population, so the river was already both a source and a receiver. That contradiction sharpened in Edwin Chadwick's sanitary work. In 1842, his report on the laboring population used numbers to tie poor living conditions to disease and shorter lives. It rested on surveys, comparisons, and returns. By 1848, the first Public Health Act had given those concerns a place in government, and the Board of Health treated drainage, cleansing, and ventilation as public duties. Public health was not only about theory or medicine, it was authority too. The reforms that promised cleaner streets could increase the state's reach into crowded districts where poverty was most visible and easiest to police. Inspectors, surveyors, and commissioners moved through houses and courts with notebooks in hand. They looked at damp cellars, blocked drains, overflowing pits, and the placement of wells. They translated odor and complaint into something that could be written down. The city's attempt to clean itself could also produce new trouble. When waste was removed too quickly from one place, it did not disappear. It moved. If it was driven out toward the river could return it as drinking water. London's sanitation reforms were meant to clear the air, but they could deepen contamination of the Thames, which still served as a source for many households and companies. That is why the paper trail matters so much. A weekly return, a table, a report, a complaint about a smell in a particular court. Each one is a small correction to the story the street tells by itself. The clerk sees a number, the inspector sees a yard, the board sees a pattern. Soon the paper asks where water came from, where it went, and which drain lies near which well. Inside the house, the choice of water is often made by habit and rumor. A family may prefer one pump over another because it tastes softer or seems less disturbed after rain. A cistern may collect roof water. A barrel may keep what was carried in from the street. A pail may serve 1 hour for washing and another for scrubbing. The work is repetitive enough to disappear into the day. Someone carries the pail up the stairs, someone empties the basin, someone scrubs the scullery floor and dries the threshold with a cloth that will be damp again soon. The drain clogs, is cleared, and clogs again. The yard smells different after rain. The house remembers the weather through water, with nowhere else to go. The burden is unevenly shared. A crowded district with shallow wells, overused drains, and a thin margin for repair will feel the strain before a better-kept street does. The poor do not invent bad infrastructure, but they often live closest to its failures. That was one reason sanitary reform had such force. It pointed to real harm in the worst housing and the narrowest courts. It also gave reformers language for intervention. A wet cellar could become a case. A foul court could become an example. A neighborhood could become an object of scrutiny. The logic of drainage was simple enough to say, and difficult enough to build. Separate what people drink from what they discard. Move waste away from the house, and keep the street from feeding the well. Yet even that simple logic had to be learned against the habits of the city. Water is patient. It takes the easiest route, not the intended one. It runs under floorboards, through broken joints, along soil and brick, toward the place where the ground is weakest. Public health begins by trying to make water travel differently. And still, the old habits of smell and sight did not vanish. They remained useful because they described real conditions. A bad odor in a courtyard might point to a broken drain. A damp basement might point to a hidden leak. A sour taste in a shared supply might point to a hidden problem. The smell does not name the cause, but it can announce that something in the system has gone wrong. In that sense, the miasma idea was both mistaken and practical. A physician working a few years later would make that difficulty more precise. He would gather hospital and public records, question households, and mark places on a neighborhood plan. He would see deaths clustering near one pump and notice a brewery with a deep well nearby where the pattern was different. What mattered most was that it let water and place be seen together. The house became legible as a source, a route, and a comparison. The records keep that distress in memory. They preserve the repeated return of the same street, the same yard, the same complaint. A ledger can show that illness is not scattered at random. It can show that a cluster belongs to a source, a route, or a shared water point. The page does not smell. That is its advantage. It can keep together places that the street keeps separate. Those places will be arranged into a clearer pattern on paper: a house, a pump, a well, a drain, a street corner, a line of cases. For now, the ordinary room with its pail and sink is where the whole system touches human hands. The city's hidden work has a shape in the back kitchen, under the floor, and beyond the wall. Water enters, water leaves, and the space between those movements is where 19th century public health slowly learns what it is looking at. A map of a district can look almost harmless when it lies flat. The paper is dry, though the city it describes is not. A lamp makes a small island of light across the streets, squares, and courtyards, drawn in ink. At the edge of the desk, there may be a ruler, a worn pencil, and a list of names in a careful hand. Nothing about the room is grand. The value is in the stillness. Here, the city can be compared without being heard. Houses become positions, pumps become points, a death becomes a mark. The sheet on the desk does not smell like the neighborhood outside, but it can keep that neighborhood long enough for someone to study where illness gathers. It is only paper, but it keeps a whole district in view. After the pail and sink of the previous room, this is another surface of the same system. The household was one place where water entered and left. The desk is where the moving pieces are copied into order. A street plan, a parish list, a column of addresses, a set of dates. Together they make a line of thought. Public health often grew from such quiet arrangements of paper. Before repair or theory, there had to be a way to lay one fact beside another. The map allowed that, turning an outbreak from blur into something the eye and mind could handle together more slowly and carefully. In a 19th century city, smells were persuasive, drains were open, cesspits leaked, the river carried waste, rooms, courts, and alleys held stale air in warm weather, and the air seemed to keep evidence of what was wrong. That is why the miasma theory had such reach. It was not only a theory in books, it matched daily experience. People could smell the city, taste it, and see the grime of it in gutters and yards. A belief that disease traveled in foul air did not arise out of nowhere. It was an attempt to explain a world that truly seemed spoiled, yet smell was only one witness, and not always the best one. It named corruption without always naming its root. A bad odor could come from many places. A sick household could live beside a drain without being sick because of that drain alone. The map asked for another habit: distance, repetition, comparison. It asked where people lived, where they drew water, and whether the same source appeared again and again in the same cluster of cases. On paper, simple. In practice, it changed the whole investigation. The city no longer had to be understood by scent alone. One famous answer appeared in London in 1854 when John Snow examined a cholera outbreak through a street map and a set of records. Snow was working in a city where many still trusted the language of bad air and where the smell of waste made that language sound reasonable. But he looked for the pattern of cases. He placed the places of illness on the page. He compared one neighborhood with another. He paid attention to where water was taken, not only to where air was breathed. What emerged was a shape, a concentration of deaths around the Broad Street pump. The pump became a point on paper and then a point of argument. The strength of that map lay in its plainness. It did not need ornate drawing, color, or flourish. Small marks were enough. One house, then another, then another. The clustering was the message. Snow's investigation in London helped shape what later came to be called modern epidemiology, because it treated disease as something traced through place and pattern. The disease itself was not yet visible in microscopic terms, but the route it traveled could still be studied. That was a major change. Explanation could begin before the deepest mechanism was understood. The map did not need to know everything in order to be useful. Names matter on such a page. A street number, a parish boundary, a water company line, a residence entered in a clerk's hand. These are small pieces, but they decide whether a case can be placed. The map depends on addressable lives. That is unsettling, because many poor and crowded districts were easier to misplace. A wrong lane, a missing back court, a house recorded by description rather than number, and the pattern becomes thinner. Even so, the page can still carry enough truth to be useful. Public health, in this form, is partly the work of naming the city more carefully. At the center of the argument was water. Some households drew from supplies that had passed through a city already burdened with waste. The Thames was not simply a river in this period. It was a working channel, a source, a drain, and a moving archive of the city's habits. Water from one part could carry a different burden from water elsewhere. That is why comparisons between supplies mattered so much. They made the root of risk visible. The map on the desk was not only a map of deaths, it was also a map of shared dependence, showing that many houses could be joined by one hidden connection, even when their facades looked separate. The city's older habit had been to look for what was closest and loudest: the stink, the mud, the overflowing ditch. The map introduced a cooler kind of attention. It asked whether a case that looked local might actually belong to a broader supply route. It asked whether a household's trouble came from the air in its lane or from the water in its bucket. Those were not abstract distinctions. They changed what a board, a physician, or a local official might inspect next. A map could be carried into a meeting, unfolded beside a window, pointed at, folded again, and taken to another room. A neighborhood, once translated onto paper, could travel farther than the neighborhood. The same sheet could be studied by a physician in one room and discussed by an inspector in another. A map allows a conversation to stay anchored. A neighborhood can be pointed to without reopening the whole street. In that sense, the map is part of the machinery of persuasion behind reform. It is more orderly than the city, and that is often enough. Public health was becoming a paper practice as much as a street practice. Mortality returns, parish notes, household addresses, company records, and complaints from residents could be assembled into a shared picture. The records were imperfect, but the pattern could survive a little noise. That is why the room feels so important. The desk is where public health can pause long enough to compare. It is not the sewer, the yard, the pump, or the bed where someone lies ill. It gathers the scattered pieces from all those places. On the desk, a physician can see the scale of a neighborhood without losing the detail of a doorway. The map does not erase the human cost. It makes the cost countable in a different way. A cluster becomes legible. A route becomes suspect. The desk also holds a social difference. On one side, ordinary suffering. On the other, boards, offices, and printed returns. The map can move between them, and that is a quiet power. Many people still thought in terms of foul air, and the reasons were not foolish. The streets really were foul. Waste really did collect. The air really did turn heavy in bad weather. But the map made room for a more exact question. It suggested that smell and cause were not the same. A city could be offensive to the nose and still hide a deeper pattern in its water. That distinction mattered because it moved attention from vague atmosphere toward routes, sources, and distribution. It made the city something that could be repaired in pieces. All this came before cholera was settled in the later language of medicine. The tension is its usefulness before certainty. It trusts repeated observation, then asks officials to act on what can be shown. Repair often arrived quietly. Source reconsidered, drain rerouted, waste carried elsewhere, water taken from a cleaner place. So the paper remains on the desk, and the map refuses to let smell have the last word. In that refusal, a quieter kind of public health begins to form, one careful mark at a time, in a room where the lamp is steady and the page lies open. A ledger lies open under a steady lamp. Narrow columns keep a name, an age, a street, a cause, a date. The room is plain, made for flat paper and legible handwriting. In a city where illness moves through houses and drains, this is one place to study the city. The pattern appears only after the clerk compares page after page without hurry. The habit is older than the Victorian office. In plague-time London, the bills of mortality try to see whether death follows a pattern. John Grant reads them as an argument about population. He notices seasonal variation, town and country differences, the gap between men and women, and the heavy toll on infants. He is reading repetition. The records are never complete. Early bills come from parish clerks, and many people never enter the columns. Even so, the practice matters. It trains officials to ask what recurs, what changes with the season, what stays tied to a neighborhood. A page can be partial and still be useful. It can show that one street loses more than another, or that death gathers in one month and recedes in the next. Those unevennesses show the city has edges, channels, and concentrations. By the 19th century, the weekly returns of the General Register Office replace the old bills. Founded in 1837, it records births, deaths, and marriages and conducts the national census. The city becomes a set of repeated measurements. Each return adds a correction to the picture. A district can suddenly look heavy with loss, and a quiet street can carry more death than its neighbors. It confesses through comparison. William Farr makes that comparison systematic. He compares mortality across professions and locations. Life tables come from that work, setting life expectancy beside hazard and chance. The numbers cannot speak, but they sharpen the argument. They suggest that illness has geography, often matching class, work, and crowded housing. That is not yet a microscopic explanation, but it is a disciplined way of seeing where suffering concentrates and showing that public life leaves measurable traces. Edwin Chadwick takes a different path to the same desk. His report on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population shows that industrial towns are unhealthy even for people who are not the poorest in them. Chadwick wants drainage, cleaning, ventilation, and removal. He sees poverty, filth, and early death as linked. The housing, the streets, and the drains have entered the account. Yet the explanation most people reach for is still the smell of the city itself. Miasma, the foul vapor thought to rise from decaying matter and sewage, remains persuasive because it matches the street. The air is bad, the gutters are bad, the basements are bad, so the remedies aim at what can be cleaned, opened, washed, and carried away. Walls are scrubbed, rooms are aired, waste is removed. Wastewater management tries to separate waste from the air and surfaces people live with. Even when the reason is wrong, the work sometimes reaches the right place. Public health begins to gather offices around it. The first Public Health Act passes in 1848. The General Board of Health gives the state a more active role, and later local boards and medical officers extend it into neighborhoods. Public health becomes a profession with inspectors attached to it. John Simon helps make that shift. A local board can send an inspector into a street, a surveyor to a sewer, a medical officer into a house. The work is part of the machinery of the city. Without the microscopic explanation, observation becomes comparison rather than certainty. One street is set beside another, one season beside the next, one occupation beside another, one household water source beside the one across the road. The clues come from clustering, recurrence, and changes in water, elevation, or crowding. In the records, the same disease can look different in different places. The question is older than the answer, and the habit of asking it is one of the quiet beginnings of epidemiology. John Snow gives that method a sharper edge. In 1849, he publishes his view that cholera spreads through contaminated water rather than poisonous air, though the paper draws little attention. In the 1854 outbreak in Soho, he gathers data from local hospital and public records, questions households where cholera appears, and marks the results on a map. The points gather around Broad Street and the public pumps. One corner of the map stays suspiciously quiet, and when he looks closer, he finds a brewery with its own deep well, a pocket of water that does not move through the pump. He asks what the people there are drinking, and the answer helps explain the absence of illness. The evidence is an arrangement of facts that makes one source look more plausible than another. Even then, the city does not agree with itself. Snow persuades local officials to remove the Broad Street pump handle, but the outbreak is already fading. The General Board of Health Committee accepts his data and still calls the cause multifactorial, leaving room for miasma and for the low ground of London. Later, in 1866, William Farr is persuaded by a new outbreak of cholera and by his own data showing high mortality among people drawing water from the old Ford Reservoir. Observation does not always win at once. It returns until the pattern becomes difficult to deny. The same discipline appears far from the city streets. During the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale records the causes of soldiers' deaths across 2 years and shows that more men die from preventable disease than from injuries. Her work turns hospital deaths into an argument for reform. She counts and compares, making neglect measurable. The military ledger is not separate from the city office. Both make loss visible enough that someone might act on it. Numbers do not see microbes. They turn a vague unease into a burden that can be set beside another burden. By now, public health is no longer only a response to crisis. It is becoming a language for administration, inspection, and responsibility. The state takes a larger hand. Medical officers and clerks, surveyors and reformers, all work with returns, tables, and maps. The record connects water, waste, housing, occupation, season, and death, creating a discipline. The city becomes something that can be compared to itself, district by district, year by year, until patterns emerge that do not care whether anyone likes them. The pages do not remove sorrow, they give it shape. In that way, observation without germ theory is not a failure of knowledge so much as a careful bridge. The explanation is still partial. The smallest cause remains hidden, but the habit of looking has already changed. Smell no longer stands alone. Distance matters, water matters, counting matters. The office stays quiet while the city keeps moving, and the page holds the outline of a safer future long before that future can be fully named. A folded plan lies under a brass weight, its pencil lines crossing a pale sheet of paper. Streets, courtyards, culverts, and embankments are reduced to lines and angles. What was once scattered through basements, gutters, and riverbanks can now be imagined as a system with a course, a fall, and an exit. The city is no longer only a cluster of houses. It is a diagram of movement. A sewer is a buried argument about direction. Water should not linger under the rooms where people eat and sleep, and what falls to the ground does not have to stay there forever. That idea mattered because the older city had grown by patchwork. Drains led nowhere useful, cesspits overflowed, and gutters carried rainwater, dishwater, and waste together until they lost themselves in the mud. In a small settlement, such arrangements might seem tolerable. In London, they became pressure. The population crowded narrow districts, waste piled up in yards and basement pits, and some of it found its way into waterways expected to serve as drinking water. The city did not fail all at once. It frayed, one damp wall and one overloaded drain at a time. The engineering imagination began with that fraying. It looked at the city as slopes, branches, joins, and outlets. Surveyors marked levels, draftsmen drew cross-sections, and administrators turned complaints into reports. A sewer line had to fall at the right rate, join the right branch, pass under the right street, and leave room for the next rain. That was quiet intelligence, patient and practical. It saw that a city could be altered if water was given another route. Before the work vanished underground, it existed as ink, measurements, and calculations spread across a desk. Those desks mattered as much as the trenches. Reformers used tables and counts to connect poor housing, illness, and shortened life. They did not need microbes to see that conditions were wrong. Cleaning, drainage, and ventilation became part of a new administrative language, and health moved out of the sick room into boards, ledgers, maps, and acts of government. Miasma theory gave reform a vocabulary. Bad air seemed to explain why crowded neighborhoods suffered so often, and the smell of waste was impossible to ignore. Remove waste, open drains, wash surfaces, let air move. Those actions were real, even if the theory was partial. But the same work could also make the river more contaminated if the waste had nowhere safe to go. A faster drain was not always a safer drain. That contradiction sat heavily over the Thames. By the middle of the century, London had effectively made the river its dumping place. In the summer of 1858, the smell rose so strongly that Parliament could not comfortably ignore it. The heat made the problem impossible to keep at a distance. The stench entered the room where decisions were made, and something long spread thin through the city became concentrated enough to force action. The river, usually treated as background, became the main subject. Smell could close a building, and a building could answer back by ordering brick, labor, and design. Joseph Bazalgette, working for the Metropolitan Board of Works, shaped the answer. The plan did not empty sewers into the river, it intercepted them. Smaller street sewers fed larger main sewers, and those main lines carried the waste far enough downstream that the tidal Thames could take it away from the center of the city. The idea did not pretend the waste would disappear. It arranged for its movement, delaying it until the tide, distance, and slope could help. The shape of those sewers mattered. Bazalgette favored wide, egg-shaped brick tunnels rather than narrow pipes. The form was practical. It let the system cope with changing volumes. The lower part could still carry the current when flows were small, and there was more room above when the rains came. Brick could be laid into long curved runs and keep that curve with strength. Under the streets, brick arches and lined channels formed a second city, one made for passage instead of residence. The work was elegant in the sense of proportion, fit, and foresight. There is a particular sort of imagination in building for the future size of a problem. It assumes the city will keep growing, the waste will increase, and the system must serve more than the present year. That is why the engineering imagination deserves its name. It does not only solve what is already visible, it tries to make room for what is coming. It says a city can be worth preparing for, and that ordinary households should not be left to chance if a better route can be cut beneath the ground. And yet those routes had to be built by hands. Men dug shafts, set bricks, mixed mortar, and worked through the dampness under and beside the roads. The city above kept moving, while the ground below was opened and closed. A newly paved street looked ordinary even when a new channel ran underneath it. That ordinariness was part of the achievement. The best sewer was one that made itself unnecessary as a subject of thought, at least until something went wrong. In the meantime, it allowed homes, workshops, and public rooms to continue without the same constant press of overflow and smell. The city still needed maintenance, inspection, and repair. Water finds weak places, and roots, rubble, and silt do not respect boundaries. The network had to be entered, checked, and kept open. Even so, most people did not need to think about those passages every day. They could carry water upstairs, scrub floors, wash hands, empty pails, and draw drinking water without picturing the route below their feet. The infrastructure became part of life by becoming less visible than the problem it answered. That is one of the deepest changes a city can make. It learns to protect itself without constantly announcing the effort. When the new sewer system opened in 1865, it did not solve everything at once. The following year, cholera returned in East London, but the burden fell largely on districts that had not yet been tied into the new network. That detail mattered. It showed both the power and the incompleteness of the work. The sewers were not magic, and they were not a final answer. They were a large, careful intervention that reduced risk where they reached and left danger where they had not yet gone. Even there, the pattern was instructive. The city was beginning to reveal that disease had roots and that those roots could be changed by engineering. Sometimes the practical answer arrived first, in brick and slope and distance. The same river that once received waste now carried a different meaning in the city's mind. It remained water, tide, edge, and root, but it was no longer merely a convenient ditch at the margin of settlement. It had become a reminder that the life of a city is shaped by what it sends away. The engineering imagination understood that better than the old patchwork of drains and pits ever could. It looked beneath the street and saw not darkness alone, but structure. It looked at the flow and saw a future that could be arranged. And when the paper was finally rolled up and the desk cleared, the city above could keep breathing a little easier, while under the pavement, the brick channels kept their steady, hidden work. After the brick channels under the pavement, another room opens, a hospital records room, ledger flat under a lamp. The page is ruled into line and column. A clerk's pen makes a dry sound. Beyond are washing, footsteps, and the low traffic of a city that has brought fear indoors. In the cholera years, hospitals sorted sickness, separated it, and made it legible, so the city could begin to see itself in more than panic. Inside the wards, air mattered almost as much as linen. Windows were opened, bed frames spaced, floors washed, and curtains and sheets handled to keep odor and crowding down. The reason was often miasma, the old belief that foul air carried disease. The explanation was incomplete, but the routine was not pointless. Fresh air, cleaning, and order could interrupt infection even when the theory was wrong. The hospital also gathered paper. Admission books, discharge books, fever charts, death registers, doctor's notes. A symptom became a date. A bed became an address. A recovery or death became a mark in the margin. Once that paper existed, comparison became possible. One ward could be set beside another, 1 week beside the last, one district beside the next. The city left traces in these books before any official plan was drawn, and investigators could ask where the pattern began, where it clustered, and where it stopped. From the ledger, the scene widens to a boardroom. The Public Health Act of 1848 gave the state a stronger hand in health, felt in offices, surveys, and reports. The General Board of Health stood between reform and administration, reading numbers and turning complaints into formal action. Public health was becoming paperwork, jurisdiction, and responsibility. At first, much of that work belonged to social reformers like Edwin Chadwick, and later to John Simon, the more medical face of the same effort. Medical officers of health appeared across England, and the language shifted toward medical training, statistics, and careful description. That change altered the furniture of health. A minute book mattered, a clerk mattered, a physician's signature mattered, a map pinned to a wall mattered. A row of houses could be described as a district with a population, a mortality pattern, a drain problem, and complaints. The office did not heal anyone by itself, but it made healing into a public duty rather than a private accident. A board did not only count bodies, it handled arguments. A report could accept that a neighborhood had suffered badly while still disagreeing about why. Contaminated water, foul air, low ground, crowded housing, and visible habits could all be folded into the same discussion. The record could keep uncertainty without losing force, and a committee could still recognize danger. Boards learned to act before they were certain. Then comes the inspector's route: a narrow lane, a court, a damp cellar step, a waterlogged yard, a complainant's doorway, a market stall, a drain cover. The inspector carries a notebook. Smell is not proof by itself, but it is often the first thing that asks for attention. So the page fills with notes about refuse, standing water, blocked channels, and overcrowding. The work is repetitive, and that repetition is part of its power. Complaint becomes inspection. Inspection becomes notice. Notice becomes a return visit. The point is compliance slowly made ordinary. A fixed drain here, a cleared yard there, a house told to improve light and air, a cesspit checked, a room emptied. The notebook turns private discomfort into public procedure. The city becomes a chain of small obligations, each linking a house to wider authority. Even before the cause was understood in microbial terms, hospital reformers prized ventilation, cleanliness, and the washing of walls and floors. Fresh air was treated as a remedy against bad smells, and that belief pushed wards toward better conditions. The explanation could be wrong, and the practice still helpful. Open air meant fewer crowded surfaces and less lingering contamination. A room kept clean and breathable was safer. The ward became a place where good housekeeping and public health overlapped. Those hospitals were never the only places receiving the sick. There were charitable beds, infirmary spaces, and other places where the city stored its illness, each with its own rules and limits. Some answered to private donors, some to local authority, some to a changing mix of both. The boundaries between care and control were visible at the doorway. Admission could mean relief, supervision, or both. Public health grew up beside those thresholds, learning that the city could not protect itself only by treating the already sick. It also had to decide who would be counted and where they would be housed. The papers were medical, but they were never free of politics. Public health could improve a district, and it could also watch it more closely than wealthier neighbors. The same office that ordered cleaner drains might also inspect the poor with a hard eye. Boards and inspectors were instruments of care and discipline. The ledger could protect and police at the same time. Statistics gave those institutions another kind of reach. Mortality returns, hospital registers, committee reports, and maps let officials compare places without relying only on smell or rumor. A page of figures could show where disease pressed hardest, and a map could show a cluster or point toward a reservoir, a street, or a neighborhood with old drainage and poor water. The hospital bed and the street corner entered the same conversation through numbers. That conversation was not always tidy. Snow's hospital records, public records, and maps did not end disagreement at once. A committee could admit evidence and still hesitate over the conclusion. One officer might trust water more than air. Another might trust statistics more than either. Yet even disagreement left behind better records, and better records made it harder for the city to remain blind to itself. By the time an inspector closed a notebook and a clerk filed another return, the public had started to live within a new kind of attention. In that attention, public health stopped being a single idea and became a method. It had rooms, offices, routes, and signatures. It had people who entered houses, people who read ledgers, people who revised reports, and people who kept open the windows in wards that had grown too close and too warm. The city was learning, slowly, that health could be protected by ordinary attention. Another visit, another page, another inspection, another choice to keep air moving and refuse moving out. It was slow, practical work, done page by page and house by house, until the city could recognize its own patterns without panic or guesswork. A city that can be recorded, can be repaired, one register, one inspection, one ward at a time. At the curb, the city becomes a floor that can be swept. Morning light lies thin on the stones, and the first change is at the edge where pavement meets gutter. Before traffic thickens, a broom gathers the night's loose matter, soot from grates, straw from packing, wet paper, cabbage leaves, grit, ash, and the dark paste left by wheels. A road is also a collecting surface. It catches what falls from doorsteps, carts, stalls, and windows, and keeps its record in fragments until someone clears it away. The work is simple, only from a distance. One pass gathers the light things, another loosens what is dried. A scraper lifts what the bristles cannot move, and a shovel tips the pile into a barrow or cart. If rain has fallen, the refuse clings. If it is dry, dust rises again. Nothing stays removed for long. A street is cleaned, and then cleaned again, because every hour adds another layer of passage. That repetition mattered, because the street showed the city's habits. What a household set aside reached the curb. What an animal dropped stayed there until someone bent to it. What the day broke apart settled in the road and at the mouths of drains. A clean street promised more than neat appearance. For people who believed bad air carried disease, it promised less of the odor that seemed to rise from decay itself. The road became another floor in the house, broader, harder to manage, and shared by strangers. Sanitary reformers trusted that visible order. They wanted waste removed quickly, damp places drained, and anything that gave off a foul smell taken away before it could linger. Washing walls and floors belonged to the same logic as clearing the street outside, as did ventilation, drainage, and the quick handling of refuse. In that world, smell was not a small detail. It was a clue, a warning, and sometimes an argument. If a place stank, it seemed to announce that something unhealthy had already begun, yet smell did not tell the whole truth. A gutter could be cleared and still lead to a blocked channel. A roadway could look bright after sweeping and still hide a wet seam where water stood too long. The city learned to look down as well as across. It was not enough to brush away visible filth. The places where water settled, where drainage failed, and where waste returned after each rain had to be found and opened. That made street cleaning a kind of inspection. The worker with the broom and the clerk with the notebook were not doing the same labor, but they were seeing the same trouble from different heights. A dirty corner that kept reappearing in reports became more than a nuisance. It became a pattern. A clogged grate, a sagging paving stone, a lane where washing always ended in another smell. Each could be set down, compared, and returned to on the next visit. Public health was growing through repetition. Water was part of the work too. Buckets and carts helped move mud into the channels that carried runoff away. But the problem did not stop there. Water that left the curb entered drains, then larger conduits, then the wider network below the city. In the 19th century, the focus often rested on separating smelly materials from the places people occupied. The street could be improved while the deeper system still lagged behind. London's growth made that imbalance harder to ignore. The city had outgrown old habits of disposal, and the waste of dense neighborhoods pressed against old arrangements. Human waste, road filth, and sewage were part of the same crowded problem, even if each was handled differently. Cleaning the street answered the most immediate layer: the curb, the gutter, the doorway, the passage. Below that layer, the city had to build longer channels and deeper conduits to carry the burden elsewhere. Weather changed the answer from day to day. Rain turned dust into paste. Dry weeks turned the road into powder. In winter, slush gathered at the edges and hardened into dark ridges. In summer, the heat sharpened every smell. The same route could look neglected every morning, even after labor. That was why the work could not be treated as an emergency response alone. It had to become routine, built into the day, like drawing water or opening a door. Routine also made the work public. A swept street could be seen from a doorway, a coach seat, or the shop front. It said that someone had kept watch. Cleanliness had political meaning as well as medical meaning, because not every district was attended equally. The stones underfoot showed who was being maintained and who was left to cope longer. The workers were rarely remembered by name, though they held the city together. A street is also a route, carrying people from house to market, from workshop to pump, from lodging to river, and from complaint to office. Every sweep changes that route a little, deciding whether a thing stays underfoot or moves into the barrow, whether water pools by the step or runs toward the grate. For reformers like Chadwick, cleaning, drainage, and ventilation were meant to improve the health of working people and lessen the burden of disease in crowded neighborhoods. The theory of the time linked the smell of decay with illness, so street cleaning took on a larger purpose. A block was being made less offensive to the air and less saturated with what seemed to breed danger. Still, the city was learning by partial success. A swept road could show that a district was being cared for, but it could also hide a system that remained overloaded. Waste removed from the surface did not vanish from the urban body. It went somewhere else. The same age that wiped the curb was trying to move waste through sewers, drains, and longer channels beyond the densest streets. Early morning gave the work its first chance. Later, carts would clog the road. Market traffic would scatter fresh debris. In wet weather, the sweep became a scrape. In dry weather, a careful gathering before the dust could rise. A good street could look ordinary by noon, which was exactly the point. Ordinary meant passable. A cleared gutter is noticed only when it is blocked. A passable road is noticed only when it is not. The work sat between attention and invisibility. It had to be seen in order to be valued, and it had to vanish into the comfort it made possible. That is why it belonged to the slow birth of public health. By the time the morning was fully underway, the road looked ready for use again. The curb had been opened. The gutter had been drawn clear. The smell had thinned enough that a door could stand ajar without immediately announcing the street. That was a narrow kind of victory, but cities are often kept alive by narrow victories. The real work was a small margin of habitability that made it easier to cross the block, open the shop, carry the basket, and breathe easier while the day went on. And soon enough, the same water that helped wash the stones would reappear at thresholds and sinks and pails inside the house, carried by hands that had crossed the curb. The city and the home shared burden and supply, one bucket at a time. At the back door, the bucket has crossed from street to house. In many 19th century homes, water still came by effort, from a pump, standpipe, cistern, rain barrel, or cart stopped down the street, and then had to be carried where it would be used. The scullery, kitchen, washstand, and kettle formed a domestic network that decided when a face could be washed, a pot rinsed, linen soaked, a floor scrubbed, and the day put back into order. The path was never straight. A house might keep water in a covered vessel, a tank above the ceiling, a stone cistern, or a butt behind the yard gate. In better connected streets, a tap shortened the journey. But even where pipes were appearing, the work did not vanish. Someone still had to open the valve, fill the jug, carry it up the stair, and set it down without spilling. Water only became useful when it could be trusted long enough to live in the house. The scullery was where water took on its errands. A little was warmed for washing a face, a little poured into a pot, a little left for rinsing spoons, cleaning a knife, soaking a cloth, or dampening dust from a shelf. On wash day, steam rose near the copper, and a tub stood open, while linen was lifted, wrung, folded, and lifted again. The room was small, but it held repeated labor. It also made water serious in the age of cholera, because clean water and used water sat only a few steps apart. Once water crossed the threshold, it mingled with the rest of the house. It picked up grease, ash, mud, crumbs, and the gray trace left in a basin after washing. If the drain was poor, the problem lingered in the yard, cellar, or wall behind the sink. Stagnant water, a blocked pipe, a damp cellar, a cesspit too close, a sink that kept its smell. These were failures in the route by which a home kept itself fit to live in. Reformers kept returning to bad air because bad air was plain to the senses, but the senses were pointing at wet places, dirty places, and broken paths between them. That is why cholera rarely stayed a theory for long. It entered the street, the pump, the yard, the kitchen, and the bedroom basin. Some observers blamed the air above courtyards and drains, especially in crowded neighborhoods where waste had been left to gather and rot. Others looked harder at the route water took from a shared source into many households. A public pump was not just a convenience, it was a meeting point for rows of cups and kettles and pitchers. A well near a leaking drain was not just a bad smell, it was a connection. Even before anyone agreed on a final explanation, drawing water had become something to inspect. The city then began to leave its mark on paper. Inspectors listed complaints, clerks copied addresses, and reformers gathered figures about drains, wells, cellar damp, and water supply. A map on a desk could give a street a second life. Tables showed the shape of a problem people had already lived through in kitchens and courtyards. The city slowly became legible in numbers, and water was one of the things that made it so. Where it came from, where it pooled, where it spoiled, where it ran off, where it was carried in, all of that began to appear in reports, not just in memory. Larger works followed. Sewers were enlarged, streets were drained, waste was pushed farther from the center of the city. The river, long burdened with too much of the town's discard, became less a convenience than a problem to be solved by design. They made the journey to the home more reliable, and the journey away from it less dangerous. When water works well, it disappears into habit. Yet someone still has to carry the pail, fill the jug, warm the kettle, empty the basin, and start again. Infrastructure changed the burden. It did not make the burden vanish. Water in the house was never only a convenience, it was a daily measure of repair. It touched the face first, then the kitchen, the laundry, the floor, and the bedroom. A child's hands were washed in it. A dish was rinsed in it. A shirt was soaked in it. A little water stood beside the bed in a jug with a narrow neck and a covered top, ready for thirst or morning washing. Cleanliness was a rhythm of carrying, heating, covering, and emptying. When sickness entered a house, water moved closer to the bed. The jug sat on the washstand. The basin waited on a chair. A towel was folded within reach. The room became, by evening, a place of careful tending, and the water there had to be clear, covered, and easy to reach. Even then, the same old labor remained in the background. Someone still carried it, warmed it, and emptied it afterward. The bucket stayed near the door, where the next need could find it. In that way, water linked daily chores with bedside care. That rhythm belonged to labor, and labor had its own shape. In a smaller lodging, it fell to whoever had the nearest hands. Water was heavy, especially up more than one flight. Buckets strained the wrist, and a pail set down too fast could make more work before breakfast. The labor was often taken for granted. It became visible only when it stopped, when a pump failed, when a pipe burst, when the street supply was cut, when the household had to wait. Then everyone noticed that the day had been organized around water's arrival. Boards, commissioners, and engineers watched those failures from different rooms. In offices, the problem became a report. In kitchens, it remained a chore. The two rooms were joined by the same pipe, the same cart route, or the same drain. This was the slow lesson of the century. Water could no longer be treated as simply found or fetched. It had to be managed from source to sink, from street to stair, from river to basin. Miasmatic language emphasized smell, and smell mattered because it pointed to things left wet or left near the house too long. But practical reform kept circling back to circulation. Water had to move in, waste had to move out, and the two movements could not be confused. By the time a filled pitcher stood quietly on a bedside table, the city's work had already traveled a long way. It had passed through a yard, a stair, a doorway, a room of heat, a place of washing, a place of storage, and a place of sleep. That journey was easy to miss because it ended so calmly. Yet the calm depended on all the effort before it. The water that reached the house was not separate from the street outside, the drain under the floor, the river downstream, or the arguments that changed how cities were built. It was the same story in a smaller shape. A house that could carry water well was a house reached by public repair, one bucket at a time. In a small room off a municipal corridor, a ledger lies open under a green lamp. Outside, the house has its own bucket, basin, and drain, but this room keeps a second version of the city's life. Complaints arrive in ruled columns. A court smells bad. A gutter is blocked. A cellar stays damp. A pump has gone strange. A lane carries refuse after rain. Public health does not yet sound like a single authority. It sounds like copying, sorting, comparing, and turning worry into a form that can travel. When cholera arrived in London in 1831, the city's language had to stretch to keep the shock. Fear moved quickly, and so did the urge to explain. The streets were already burdened by industrial growth and by waste the old arrangements could no longer carry away. Human refuse gathered in courtyards, basement cesspits overflowed into gutters and waterways. In that setting, foul air seemed a serious answer because the smell was everywhere and felt like evidence. Public health began with what could be seen, smelled, and measured in place. Nuisance, filth, decay, crowding, and drainage gone wrong. By 1842, that blunt language had been gathered into a report. Edwin Chadwick used surveys and data to argue that poor living conditions, disease, and life expectancy were tied together. The pages counted and compared, turning industrial towns into something measurable rather than merely miserable. A row of figures could carry a heavier burden than a sermon because figures could go into a committee room and across a table. The report helped inspire the Public Health Act of 1848 and the General Board of Health. The boardroom becomes part of the story. Reformers sit on one side, officials on another, and around them are circulars, notices, and reports waiting to be signed and sent. The first Public Health Act gave the state a larger role in health, and with that role came a new habit of attention. Public health was becoming a bureaucracy with powers of inspection and recommendation. The old language of bad air did not vanish, but now it had a filing system. What had been a warning began to take the shape of a service. In the streets, that service moved on foot. An inspector could walk a row of courts, look into a lodging house, stand beside a blocked channel, and mark the state of a drain in a notebook that would later be copied into a report. The work was repetitive, tedious, and that was part of its strength. One visit could be dismissed. 100 visits became a pattern. Public health learned that a city could be known by return visits, by notes taken in the same places over and over, by the habit of comparing one yard with another room, another set of papers. The old bills of mortality had long taught London to count deaths during plague, but by 1840, they were giving way to the weekly returns of the General Register Office. Deaths could now be lined up by district, occupation, age, and season with more regularity than before. William Farr built much of his work from that material, giving medical statistics a firmer place in government. Numbers could not explain everything, but they could expose difference and show that some streets, trades, and ways of living carried more death than others. On another desk, a map of Soho is spread flat. John Snow marks deaths around Broad Street and arranges them into a shape that can be argued with. The paper does not merely illustrate the outbreak, it asks a question the street must answer. In 1854, Snow's investigation showed many features that later epidemiology would use, even if the influence on policy at the time was limited. He showed his evidence to local authorities and helped persuade them to remove the handle from the pump. Though the worst of the outbreak had already begun to pass, the argument does not settle there. In the same administrative world, William Farr at the General Register Office did not accept Snow's waterborne explanation. Public health in the middle of the century is full of such incomplete agreement. Some officials read the city through smell, others begin to read it through mortality data. Some trust the street-level witness, others trust the registry. The field is learning a language, but the language is not yet unified. Public health also carries a second burden. It can protect and it can police. The same regulations that aim at drainage and refuse can land more heavily on poor neighborhoods than on comfortable ones. The same habit of inspection can become a habit of control. The history is not only about cleaner streets. It is also about who is named unsanitary first, who is ordered to move, who is judged by the state, and who gets watched more closely than others. In the 19th century, that relationship is shaped by class, authority, and the language of improvement. By the later 1840s and into the 1850s, doctors begin to stand more centrally in that system. John Simon becomes London's first medical officer of health, and the older world of solitary reform gives way to a broader administration of specialists, investigators, and health workers. The work spreads out. It now includes food adulteration, occupational disease, maternity, and childcare, along with drainage and sanitation. Local boards of health bring new structure to the city, and the job becomes less like a single campaign and more like a continuing service. Around the official structure, other forms of labor keep moving. Voluntary organizations, often organized and run by women, fill gaps that law cannot reach. They visit, organize, and persuade. Their work is less visible than passing a statute, but it matters because public health depends on 1,000 small acts that never become famous. The city's new voice is therefore not a single voice. It is a chorus of clerks, medical officers, nurses, inspectors, reformers, and neighbors, each repeating the same practical request in a slightly different register. What emerges from all that paper is not certainty, but a method of attention. Public health learns to speak through ledgers, maps, reports, and returns. With each page, it becomes harder to ignore the house when looking at the street, or the street when looking at the river. The vocabulary is still incomplete. It still leans on smell in one room and on counting in another. It still carries power unevenly, but it gives people a shared way to ask what changed, where it changed, and who should be responsible for the repair. The city has only begun to say that illness leaves traces and that the traces can be read. A small cabinet stands in a room with a microscope and a brass lamp. Inside are stoppered bottles from different districts, each with a paper label written in hurried hand. The glass is clouded at the shoulders from repeated washing. One sample came from a river, one from a well, one from a street drain after rain, and each sits upright like a patient witness. The labels do not name an illness, they name a source. That changes the room. The city is broken into pieces small enough to compare. In the older language of the street, the first evidence is smell. Bad air seemed to gather around blocked drains, refuse heaps, damp basements, crowded yards. Miasma named that feeling. It gave reform a reason to move. If foul air was danger, streets could be cleared, drains flushed, waste removed, and windows opened. The theory was wrong about the mechanism, but useful in practice. It made the city notice neglect and move. Then people asked where they drank. John Snow traced one cholera outbreak by comparing households and water sources instead of trusting the smell of the neighborhood. The pattern on paper mattered. A cluster could be seen where the eye on the street saw only ordinary movement. The map made the supply impossible to ignore. Illness was not only drifting through air, it was moving through a route that could be drawn, checked, and argued over. That change in explanation changed responsibility. If air was blamed, the city could freshen a street and feel it had acted. If water was blamed, pipes, pumps, wells, and waste routes had to answer. Smell was immediate and persuasive. That is a less pleasant truth, and one reason the older idea lasted so long. Water asked for comparison, records, and the willingness to admit that a city can harm itself through its ordinary systems. The microscope opens another scale. Medicine does not leave observation behind, it sharpens it. New disciplines gather around the lens, and the lens gathers evidence. A drop of water on glass is no longer clear or cloudy. It can keep forms too small for the nose and casual sight. The room is quiet, but it changes proof. Medicine learns to trust what can be repeated, examined, and compared. It does not replace the city outside. it gives the city a smaller witness. Little by little, bad air loosens as an explanation. The idea that disease could be carried by living things in water and waste becomes harder to dismiss, especially as microscopic study deepens and the same patterns return from outbreak to outbreak. Cholera begins to look less like vapor and more like something moving through a supply. The mystery narrows, the old story and the new one linger together. Practical reform moves before theory agrees. Drinking water is taken from cleaner sources where possible. Water is filtered. Waste is carried farther from the places that draw drinking water in. Later, disinfection joins those changes. The point is separation, protection, and treatment. A city does not get safer by wishing the river away. It gets safer by refusing to let the wrong things meet in the wrong place. The work is plain, repetitive, and exacting, which is part of why it lasts. The river is the patient object that never stays in one room. It moves under bridges, past laundries and wharves, beside intakes and outfalls, carrying a city's confidence as well as its waste. Once it is seen as a route rather than a backdrop, the work changes. Its banks matter. Upstream matters. The place where drinking water enters the system matters as much as the place where refuse leaves it. That shift is quiet but severe. Boards of health, inspectors, engineers, and clerks turn that idea into routine. A notebook is opened at a doorway. An order is written. A complaint about a drain is copied into a ledger. A map is marked and marked again. It lets one street be compared with another, one supply with another, one district with another. Public health becomes a habit of looking, writing, and returning. In a hospital ward, the basin by the bed and the folded linen at the foot of the chair belong to the same chain of thought. The room is private only in appearance. Air moves out, water enters. Hands, towels, floors, and drains all carry part of the burden. The ward is one more place where the city's systems meet the body, and cleaning becomes part of the city's defense. A new vocabulary grows around these habits. Epidemiology gives a name to comparison. It asks which streets share a supply, which households cluster around a source, and which parts of the city carry a heavier burden. The map becomes more than a picture. It becomes a way of thinking. A cluster can point to a common route before anyone has the final explanation. A line of figures can say what a single visit cannot. Still, the older language does not vanish. Smell remains persuasive because it is immediate. It tells the truth about neglect, even when it does not tell the truth about cause. A bad drain is still a bad drain. A crowded court still announces itself to the senses. For a long time, the city lives with both explanations at once, one in the air and one on the laboratory table. The newer language of microbes is more exact but not universal. The practical changes, once made, start to disappear into habit. Pipes run under the street and are forgotten. Filter beds do their work without ceremony. Protected sources become ordinary. A safer supply is most visible when it fails, which is why success so often looks like silence. The city becomes one whose hidden systems are taken for granted. The microscope does not cancel the map, it joins it. One gives a smaller world. The other gives a wider one. Between them, public health learns to read the city through traces, water, waste, repeated illness, and the difference between one supply and another. The room has changed. There is a bottle on the desk, a slide under the lens, and the steady sense that illness leaves a route that can be interrupted. The map can be folded away, but the ledger remains open. On the desk sits a brass inkwell, beside returns, complaint slips, and a bound volume worn soft by years of use. Its ruled pages ask the city to sit still long enough to be counted. One column takes a name, another a street, another a date. The hand that writes them only knows they must be kept. Illness changes when it reaches the page. It becomes smaller, portable, and durable. A death in one house, another in the next lane, another near a river landing. A hospital register marks admissions and departures. An inspector notes a broken drain, a foul yard, a tenant's complaint, a bucket of waste tipped where it should not have been. Together, they begin to lean toward one another, and repetition takes shape. For a long time, Smell seemed explanation enough. Bad air sat in cellars, gutters, crowded courts, cesspits, and overworked drains. The older logic of miasma was not foolish. A city that reeks is a city asking for attention, and the nose often notices damage before the ledger does. Yet smell is only one witness. The page keeps more distance. It can compare one street with another, one week with the next, one supply with another. That difference matters. Two rows of houses can look alike from the pavement and still belong to different worlds once the water is traced back to its source. One side of a road can drink from one supply, the other from another. One district can fill with illness while the neighboring district remains less troubled. Not every cluster can be explained by smell alone. The city starts to reveal itself as a set of connections, not just bad air. John Snow's investigation in 1854 mattered because it made that habit of comparison visible. It did not rest on one famous map alone. It gathered addresses, interviews, deaths, and repeated cases into a single argument. The neighborhood had its own reasons for belief, but the pattern around contaminated water pressed against it. The map gave shape to what the pages already suggested. Illness was gathering where people drew their drink. The source was in the route the water took into the house. That is where epidemiology begins to take its place. The word may sound clinical, but its work is practical. It studies how disease spreads and how it can be controlled among populations and changing neighborhoods. It asks where cases gather, when they rise, and what they share. It looks for clues in the distance between one address and the next. A cluster is not an accident to be ignored, but evidence of a common source. The record keeps turning up those clues in quiet forms. An annual report arrives with totals for one ward and then another. A table carries many names. An inspector's notebook records a yard, a privy, a drain, the odor from a ditch after rain. These are working papers. They pass through hands that need no theory to write down what they see. The figures move from the street into the office, then into committees where they are compared and discussed. The city slowly learns to speak in the language of contrast. A line in a report can justify a sewer, a diverted outfall, a cleaner source of water, a different route for waste. Counting becomes a public argument. The page does not lay pipes or dig trenches, but it can decide which part of the city needs attention first. It can make a buried problem legible long before repair is visible. That work depends on records staying alive long enough to be compared. A single week means little by itself. A single neighborhood can mislead. But a run of weeks, a chain of returns, a season of complaints, a set of deaths clustered around one source, those begin to carry weight. The city can be read across time. A damp lane may show the same burden. Comparison makes the invisible ordinary. It shows the problem is not random. The pages are never complete. Names are missed. Ages are guessed. Addresses are copied badly. Some illnesses never enter the record. The poor are counted unevenly. The busy clerk may write one thing where another was meant. And still, partial records can reveal enough to guide action. A map does not need every house to show a concentration. A ledger does not need every death to show a repeated source. The work is slower, but it does not stop. What changes, in the end, is the city's sense of what a clue looks like. A smell may still matter. A complaint may still matter. A death certificate may matter. But now, they can be placed beside one another, grouped by street, water source, week, ward, and the path that waste takes after it leaves a house. Out of that grouping comes a different public health habit. It does not wait for perfect knowledge. It trusts that repeated trouble deserves repeated attention. That habit grows alongside the institutions that carry it. Boards of health, inspectors, registrars, and municipal officers spend their days with paper because paper can move farther than a single pair of eyes. It can be taken to a meeting, copied into another book, and returned with a decision attached. The city becomes a sequence of documents. One book lists complaints, another deaths, another drains, another the repairs that followed. When they are placed together, a route appears through the life of the place. The route is not only one of illness, it is also one of response. Waste that enters a river does not simply disappear. If the same river helps supply the city, the consequence comes back. That realization takes time. It arrives in fits and starts, as records accumulate and comparisons harden into convictions. The mind learns to ask not only where sickness is seen, but where the conditions for it are being made. That is a quieter question than blame. It is a more useful one. In that quieter way, the old city begins to lose its mystery, not all at once, not cleanly, but enough to matter. The page shows what the street alone cannot. The street shows what the theory cannot. Between them, public health becomes an art of looking twice, keeping the list, and noticing when the same burden falls again on the same place. The habit has changed. The city has started to understand itself as something that can be measured, compared, and, little by little, repaired. On the clerk's desk, the ledger looks cleaner than the streets it records. Its ruled pages, narrow margins, and steady ink make room for names, ages, addresses, occupations, and the small marks by which a city learns to count itself. It cannot keep the smell from the alley, the damp in the lower room, or the habit of carrying water past a heap of waste, but it can still show repetition, burden, and the unequal way sickness falls across a city. Older bills of mortality taught London to read death in columns, and the newer returns and registers made comparison sharper. By mid-century, weekly records from the General Register Office, with hospital and parish information, let reformers set district against district, occupation against occupation, street against street. Numbers could not tell the whole story, but they could show where loss kept returning and where strain fell unevenly. That pattern came into view in the office, where a doctor or inspector sits with a map, notes, and questions from the street. Households are asked where the water comes from, where waste goes, which pump is used, which yard stays damp, which lane fills after rain. The answers are plain, but together they expose how a neighborhood is built. The map does not invent the differences. It only gives them a shape that can be seen. At street level, protection arrives in pieces. A pipe reaches one block, while another still depends on a pump. A drain serves one frontage, while the next court waits for repair. Some houses stand higher and drier, with more room between sleeping place and midden. At the sink and basin, the difference becomes physical. In one house, a vessel can rest in the wash place. In another, it is carried upstairs and set down in crowded rooms. In a city, distance is measured not only in yards, but in rent, service, and who gets connected first. Edwin Chadwick's surveys gave that truth a hard edge. His tables connected poor living conditions with disease and shorter lives, and they showed that industrial towns were unhealthy even for wealthier inhabitants, not only for laboring poor. The point was not that only the poor suffered. It was that the burden fell most heavily where housing was tightest, drains weakest, and air least renewed. Numbers could say that a city's health was not evenly spread across its streets. Public health in this period was never only medical, it was also a social movement and an administrative system. By the first Public Health Act, the state begins to take more responsibility for its citizens, and the same measures that promise cleaner rooms can also bring sharper watching. Some regulations aim at disease, some at order, and some at the poor themselves. The resident ordered to clear waste or improve a dwelling is not always treated as someone with a right to safety. Sometimes the resident becomes a problem to be managed, and the city learns to protect itself through inspection as much as repair. The public office grows busier. Local boards, medical officers, investigators, and health workers visit streets, collect returns, inspect yards, and write notices. A complaint may begin with smell, but it often ends with measurement: the width of a drain, the state of a closet, the line of a water connection, the condition of a room below ground level. In the infirmary or hospital, linen makes the burden visible in another way. Sheets, aprons, and cloths move from bed to basin to washhouse and back again, carrying evidence of sickness and crowding. A clean sheet is not a clean street, but both depend on washing, sorting, carrying, and returning. In the ward, another book appears, the admission register. It lists beds filled, cases moved, linen exchanged, and names set beside an illness that never fully explains itself. It is only paper and ink, yet it shows how closely disease follows crowding. One ward empties late, another fills early, and the poorest rooms ask illness to do its hardest work there. The older language of miasma gave reformers a reason to look at foul air, and foul air was not imaginary. Waste and sewage really were there, and they really did make cholera easier to spread. Yet smell is a rough guide to justice. The worst-smelling street is not always the one with the least power, and the most dangerous place is not always the one that offends the nose first. Behind the theory of bad air sits another fact. The city was not exposing everyone equally. That is why the water question keeps returning. One district draws from a source touched by the city's waste. Another is served differently. One household shares a pump or common well. Another has a separate supply farther from the drains. The difference may be hidden in the walls or yard, but it is not hidden from disease. When the records are laid side by side, the pattern is hard to ignore. Protection is not a single thing. It arrives in layers, and the layers are uneven. John Snow's work matters here, not only because it pointed to cholera in contaminated water, but because it showed how comparison could uncover inequality within the same city. He gathered hospital and public records, asked households where they drew their drinking water, and marked his findings on a map. The map did not merely point to a pump, it showed that disease gathered where the city's arrangements allowed it to gather. Later statistics would compare deaths by place, profession, and supply, and the numbers kept saying the same quiet thing: location changes risk. The river beyond the drains carries the burden farther downstream. What one street sends away becomes another district's burden, and the city's clean edge is always someone else's foul water. The lesson is slow, because the nuisance is hidden once it moves out of sight, yet the ledger keeps its memory. A complaint that leaves one neighborhood may return as trouble in another. Waste is not gone just because it has been pushed out of view. It is merely relocated, and the relocation itself is part of inequality. Unequal protection also has a clock. The better served street gets its improvement and moves on. The neglected one waits through one season, then another. By the time the work arrives, the place has taught its residents to expect less. Public health has to repair not only pipes and drains, but expectation, and it has to interrupt the habit of assuming some streets will always be repaired last. The city's protective habits remain uneven because the city itself is uneven. A reform can be broad, while its benefits arrive in narrow bands, one street at a time. That is the real shape of this period. Not a clean break from ignorance, but a slow rearrangement of obligation. The city owes residents more than warning and a sermon. It owes water that does not pass through filth, streets that can be cleaned without drama, and records that do not look away from hardship. None of this is ordinary yet. It is being argued over, funded unevenly, and fitted into the city room by room, ledger by ledger, pipe by pipe. Still, the direction is clear. Protection is starting to mean pipes, drains, inspections, and better maps as the quiet machinery of daily life. In time, the pipe will feel ordinary. Before that happens, it must be laid, and somebody must keep the count until it is. In a municipal office, the map drawer opens with a soft scrape. Inside are streets, drains, and water mains, each sheet crossed and recrossed by hands that know the city better than any sermon does. The paper is bent at the corners, one edge swollen and dried. A block of houses has been marked again where a complaint came back. A street has one note beside it, then another note beside that note. It is maintenance, filing, and the patient habit of comparing one address with the next. The city begins to keep itself together on paper before it is held in brick. By the time cholera has pushed officials toward reform, the work depends less on fear than on returns, inspections, and corrections. A clerk copies figures from one ledger to another. An inspector brings back blocked gullies, damp walls, and cellar rooms that smell of rot after rain. The pages persuade by repetition. A bad street appears again and again until it stops being an impression and becomes a duty. Public health, in this form, is a routine for turning trouble into action. The state has found a room in the city. It is not grand. It holds a desk, a lamp, a rack for maps, and the authority of the Public Health Act of 1848, the boards that followed it, and the medical officers who made the field more professional. By the late 1840s, medical officers of health appear with investigators beneath them. Their language is plain because their tasks are plain. Clean the street, clear the drain, watch the water, record the complaint, visit the house, repeat. Public health is now a relationship between the office and the doorstep. Outside, an iron cover is levered up. Beneath it, the sewer makes a corridor under the road. The men who built and repaired these channels worked in mud, brick dust, and gaslight, but their success was measured by disappearance. If the gully stayed clear after rain, if the basement did not flood, if waste moved away from the house, the work could pass for nothing at all. That is one of infrastructure's strange aims, to become so reliable that it can be ignored. Not every repair is hidden. Some jobs are carried out in full view. A team shovels silt from a gutter, brushes lime along a wall, clears ash from the street edge, and opens a channel narrowed through neglect. The work is ordinary in the plainest sense, yet every cleared channel changes how rain behaves, how waste moves, and how long a doorway stays wet. A city scrubbed and flushed often enough teaches its residents a new expectation. Dry feet, less stench, fewer sudden stoppages. The Great Sewer Network changed London in that way. It altered the riverfront, the streets, and the language of complaint, but most people met it only through grates and smell. Joseph Bazalgette, and the larger engineering effort behind him, made a buried order where there had been leakage and improvisation. The river had been carrying the city's waste in public for too long. Once the new channels were laid, the system outlasted the urgency that produced it. A whole generation could grow up with clean pavement overhead and never think about the brickwork below until a repair crew opened the road. A similar quietness appears in the water supply. A pipe under the street carries what used to require a bucket, a shoulder, and a long walk from a pump or yard. In some homes, the change arrives first as a steadier routine, then as a habit so ordinary that nobody remembers the old strain until the flow stops. A tap, a valve, a main, a reservoir. The route matters because it has been kept in order. The new convenience shortens the distance between household work and clean water. The map still keeps the poorer districts in place. Old inequalities do not vanish when a new system is installed. The inspector's notebook turns those differences into line after line of practical language. Blocked drain, broken gully, water smell, overflowing cesspit, damp wall, repeated complaint. The words are not beautiful, but they are exact enough to guide a crew back to the same corner. In time, patterns appear. A street that floods every winter, a yard that collects waste, a set of houses that keeps producing the same illness or odor after a storm. This is the habit that epidemiology gradually makes ordinary, the habit of looking for repetition across place and time. On another desk, the death returns arrive from the registrar. The narrow columns let one neighborhood be compared with another, one season with another. At the General Register Office, the returns become part of a larger memory of the city. William Farr and others built a language from that paper, a language of mortality rates and life tables. The numbers did not explain everything, but they showed the city was not suffering evenly. Some streets carried a burden that could be counted and argued over until it could no longer be dismissed as chance. By now, the office has become a place where the same facts are handled by different hands. The medical officer reads one set of figures, the clerk copies them. The inspector uses them to choose a route. The engineer reads the map and knows which main needs attention before frost hardens the ground. A public health system is built from that division of labor. One person holds the ledger, another the key, another the shovel, another the authority to send a notice. Together they make the city legible enough to repair. At home, the changes are smaller and easier to miss. A house may draw better water. A drain may carry waste away instead of holding it under the floorboards. A corridor may lose that stale feeling. The theories have changed by degrees. Smell still mattered, and the old idea of bad air did not vanish before new ideas were ready to replace it. Yet the city had already learned useful habits from a theory later judged incomplete. Open the space, move waste away, improve ventilation, keep water apart from waste, record what happens when a block is cleaned or a drain repaired. The practical results outlast the explanation. A city can benefit from the right action even when the reason is only partly understood. The city also keeps its victories in paper. Reports are bundled into annual accounts, placed before committees, and stacked beside earlier volumes so that one year can argue with the next. A clerk can open a report from 2 winters ago and see the same lane already troublesome and damp. There is also a softer consequence. The street that once drew alarm now draws a crew on a schedule. The drain that once caused fear now causes a requisition, and the pump that once stood at the center of attention becomes only a fitting among many fittings. That is how a public health system matures. It stops waiting for catastrophe to prove itself and starts making small, repeated corrections. The success is a morning when the work does not need to be noticed. Still, the city remains uneven. Some roads are better paved, some courts better drained, some households better supplied, and some districts better watched. The same offices that can protect can also sort, rank, and neglect. Public health has always been part medicine and part governance, part compassion and part control. The records can save lives and reinforce the old shape of the city. A map that shows disease can just as easily show who has been left in the wrong place too long. That is why the ordinary infrastructure matters so much. It is not only pipes and sewers, it is the promise that the same street will not always be forgotten. By evening, the papers are tied back into their bundles, the map drawer closes, the ink dries in the register. Outside, the street has gone quiet enough that the iron grates can keep doing their work without witness. The city above is still full of people carrying baskets, closing shutters, and finishing supper. The buried system continues its slow passing. What was once a desperate answer to sickness has become part of the background of living. It is not perfect, it is not fair, but it is there, and because it is there, a great deal of ordinary life can proceed without naming the machinery beneath it. After dark, the river changes its face, the last light breaks on the water in narrow strips, and it looks almost still until a ripple turns it over again. Lamps burn in small glass shells along the bank. Their reflections tremble and lengthen, then vanish into black water. A stone stair sinks toward the tide. Nothing here asks for attention, and that is part of the arrangement. The city has spent years placing its burdens where they can be overlooked. By day, barges come and go, laundry is carried, and rain from the streets reaches the water through gutters, drains, and brick mouths set low in the wall. In older arrangements, waste went the same way. Household refuse, wash water, chamber pots, overflowing privies, and whatever rain could loosen all found their way into the same current. The river did not care about the city's names, it only received them. The smell around a riverbank can be complicated. Some of it comes from mud and weed, some from fish, some from damp stone. In crowded districts, the air may carry the sharper breath of sewage, soot, and wet refuse in a narrow street. For many years, those odors were taken seriously because they were hard to ignore. Bad air seemed a reasonable explanation when a room was close, a court was packed with bodies, a drain had gone sour, or summer heat settled over stagnant water. Smell was one way of describing a city that had become hard to breathe, and yet the smell was only the beginning. The river accepted what the city sent, but the city also drank nearby water, washed in it, built beside it, and carried waste into the same channels. A river could be boundary and root at once. Once cholera arrived, that double life became harder to ignore. The disease seemed to move with terrible speed through towns and ports, striking where water, crowding, and poor drainage came together. People watched smell and place. They watched deaths gather in one street and then the next, as if a hidden hand had touched the map. The first answers often came not from theory, but from paper. A clerk sat with quill or pen, turning pages in a ledger, while a lamp burned low beside the ink. Names were entered, addresses were written, dates were added in neat columns. Other books held complaints about drains and blocked channels, or notes from visits to cellars and courts. These records gave shape to what felt scattered and private. A fever in one house, a death in another, a pattern in a street, a complaint from a landlord, a remark from a doctor. All of it could be compared once it was placed in a line of entries. A map on a desk could do what conversation could not. A street name marked once meant little. The same mark, repeated across a cluster of streets, began to suggest something larger. The map did not cure anything. It made the shape of the trouble visible long enough for someone to think with it. Long before microbes were understood, the city had begun to learn from repetition. If cholera returned to the same districts, those districts deserved attention. If one neighborhood with one water source suffered differently from another with a different source, that difference deserved attention too. If a drained street fared better than a flooded one, practical minds took note. The explanation might still be wrong in part, but the habit of looking, counting, and comparing was a real advance. It did not require certainty to begin. From there, the work moved into earth and brick. Streets were dug up, channels were lined. Longer sewers were planned, so waste would travel in a more controlled direction instead of lingering in open ditches or seeping through the ground. Drainage was altered, low ground was addressed, and the city began, unevenly and imperfectly, to move water in ways that were less careless. A hidden flow that once leaked into cellars, wells, and courtyards could now be drawn into larger systems and carried away with more intention. Clean water required its own attention. Some places reached farther for it, some filtered it, some guarded the sources more carefully than before. The old assumption that water was simply there, available and interchangeable, became harder to keep. Water had a route, an intake, a season, a level, and a quality that could vary from one part of the city to another. People who had once thought only of the smell of the air began to think about the line between a drinking supply and a waste channel, about the distance between a pump and a drain, about the point where a river turned from a source into a problem. There were boards and offices for that work, and men whose days were spent in boots and coats, stepping into yards, bending over grates, measuring rises and falls, and writing notices. An inspector's duty was rarely dramatic. More often, it meant return visits, reminders, and the patient correction of small defects that only seemed small until they were added together. A blocked drain in one place, a leaking pipe in another, a court where refuse had gathered, a basement whose dampness suggested some deeper failure beneath the surface. The city was being asked, one order at a time, to keep its own material life in better condition. Not everyone benefited equally from that repetition. Some streets were reached sooner than others. Some districts were easier to neglect. A house on higher ground, with private water and better drainage, stood in a different relation to cholera than a row of overcrowded rooms near a foul channel or a river edge. The poor were often asked to live closest to the city's leftovers and then blamed when disease gathered there. Public works could reduce that injustice, but they could not erase it at once. Even when the pipes improved, the old maps of advantage and neglect remained in place for a long time. That unevenness is one reason the records mattered. They made the city answerable to its own patterns. A clerk's column, a doctor's list, an engineer's note, a burial register, a report from a neighborhood visit, each gave the same general fact a different angle. Illness did not arrive as a theory. It arrived as a household loss, then as a street, then as a district, then as a row in a ledger. Out of those practical struggles came a way of thinking that linked illness to place, water, movement, and exposure. By the time the river is dark, that way of thinking has already been built into the city's hidden life: a culvert under a road, a brick tunnel behind a wall, a widened conduit beneath the paving stones, a sluice gate, a pumping station, a covered channel, a repair trench, all of them part of an arrangement most people will never see in full. The city above can go on finishing supper, closing shutters, counting coins, and setting out clothes for the next day. Below it, the route of waste and rain and overflow continues on its appointed way. The work has become ordinary enough to vanish from notice, which is often the sign that it has begun to succeed. Still, the river remains there, carrying more than one meaning. It reflects the lamps, it receives the drain, it moves past wharves and under bridges and out toward the tidal edge. It can look almost peaceful in the dark. That peace is not innocence, it is labor made stable. It is a set of decisions repeated so many times that they begin to feel like the natural shape of the city. The smell weakens in one place, a pump is moved, a channel is cleared, a map is corrected. A street is paved, a source is guarded more carefully. A household no longer has to trust a water place that has been too close to something foul. None of this produces a perfect world, it produces a livable one, and so the river after dark becomes less a symbol than an arrangement. The city puts what it must into channels. It keeps records, it inspects, repairs, reroutes, and counts again. It learns, slowly, that illness can be made less common without being named all at once. It learns that the air is not the only thing to watch, and that water, like air, has a path and a consequence. It learns that the hidden works beneath the street are part of everyday safety. Then the lamps along the embankment burn lower, the tide turns, and the water continues its steady motion past the stone wall. Above it, one window after another goes dark, and the city rests for the night inside the systems it has built to carry what it cannot keep.